You don't need to imagine medieval torture. You need to imagine the paperwork. Because the most terrifying thing about it wasn't the screaming. It was how calmly it was recorded. Picture this, a room under a palace where the air never feels clean. Not because of blood. Because of time. Because pain lived there so long it soaked into stone. Somewhere in the dark, water ticks, one drop at a time, like a metronome keeping rhythm for the next mistake. A man is hanging by his arms, hands tied behind his back. Not dramatic. Not movie torture. Just physics doing what physics does. Shoulders slip out. Nerves start to burn. Your body starts to panic, and then minutes later, panic becomes routine. And that's when the real horror begins. Because the people in charge weren't guessing. They weren't barbarians improvising cruelty. They were specialists. They watched breathing. They watched eye movement. They knew exactly how to keep someone alive long enough to stop being a person. And here's the part that should make your stomach drop. A confession wasn't the goal. A useful confession was. So they built methods that didn't just hurt. They rewired memory. They turned fear into loyalty. They made innocent people create stories so detailed they sounded true. In a moment, I'm going to start with a technique that didn't even need blades, because it attacked the one place you can't protect, your mind. And once you hear how it worked, you'll understand why some victims confessed and still begged to be tortured again. They called it the vigil. A word that sounds almost holy, until you realize it meant this: you don't get to sleep again until we decide you're a different person. At first it's simple. A guard. A stick. Every time your eyelids dip, tap. Shake. Drag you upright. You swear you can handle it. It's just tiredness, right? Then the third night hits. Your thoughts stop lining up. Time stretches like hot wax. Shadows don't stay still. A drip in the corner becomes footsteps. A whisper becomes a voice saying your name like it's right behind your ear. And here's the part medieval interrogators learned through cold trial and error. After enough sleeplessness, the brain doesn't just hallucinate. It negotiates. It offers anything, memories, names, sins you never committed, just to earn 1 hour of darkness. But they didn't want a ranting, broken confession. That looked forced. That looked illegal, even back then. So they used a loop. They keep you awake until you crack. Then they let you sleep just enough to stand. Just enough to speak clearly. Then they ask again, calmly, like a priest, like a judge. Confirm your confession. If you recant, the vigil starts over. After weeks of that, something terrifying happens. You stop knowing what's real. The lie you invented becomes the only story your mind can find. And when you finally confess voluntarily, the court smiles, because now it counts. That's why this method spread. No scars. No broken bones. Just a person walking into the courtroom with eyes that don't belong to them anymore. And once they realized the mind could be dismantled without leaving marks, they designed an instrument that did the opposite. It left no visible damage, but it destroyed you from the inside. They could show it to you in the torturer's palm. Small. Polished. Almost elegant. Like something a doctor would use. And that's what made people confess before it even touched them, because your brain hates one thing more than pain. Uncertainty. This device had a simple promise: it wouldn't cut you open from the outside. It would expand you from within. A metal pear, split into segments, with a screw at the base. Turn the screw and the sections separate, slowly. Not violently. Not fast. Millimeter by millimeter, like someone adjusting a dial. The cruelty wasn't just what it did. It was how long the operator could keep you right at the edge of tearing. If you pass out, they pause. If you vomit, they pause. If your body gives them an excuse to stop, they don't stop. They reset you, and continue. Different accusations had different placements. The punishment was designed to match the sin, so the victim wouldn't just feel pain. They'd feel meaning. And the courts wrote it down like a recipe: duration, compliance, results. In some cities, craftsmen built variants in sizes. Some with ridges. Some with spikes. Some engraved with religious symbols. So the last thing you saw before you broke was a saint staring back at you. Here's what modern people miss: this wasn't random brutality. This was controlled engineering, built around one goal: maximum suffering with minimum chance of quick death. Because a dead prisoner can't be questioned, and a public corpse can't be paraded as proof that justice was served. And when authorities wanted a method that could run for hours with almost no supervision, they built a machine that used the victim's own body weight as the blade. A wooden pyramid. A rope. And time. Imagine walking into a room and seeing it before you understand it. A pyramid, waist high. Wood. Sometimes stone. Sometimes reinforced with metal. The tip isn't sharp like a spear. It's worse. It's precise. Because the point wasn't designed to end anything quickly. It was designed to make your body do the work. They strip you. Bind you. Suspend you from a beam so your feet barely touch the floor. Then they lower you, slow, until the apex presses where your instincts scream at you to protect. At first, it's pressure. You can hold yourself up. You can keep your muscles tight. You can survive the moment. That's the trap. Because minutes turn into hours. Your legs tremble. Your arms burn. Your back spasms. And every time your strength slips, you sink. No dramatic strikes. No flailing executioner. Just gravity and exhaustion negotiating with your nervous system, inch by inch. Victims weren't impaled all at once. They were fed into the point over time. If you faint, they raise you a fraction. Not to save you, just to keep you alive enough to continue. And here's why it became popular in the medieval justice system: it was efficient. One guard could oversee it. It left few obvious marks on the surface. In some places, they could drag you into court afterward and claim you were never tortured at all. But inside? Internal tearing. Infection waiting like a clock that's already ticking. And while the pyramid worked on the body, authorities never forgot the audience. They wanted fear to spread faster than any confession. So they created punishments that were not just painful, but symbolic, designed to destroy identity, reputation, even gender. The next instrument was used so often on women that it became a message carved into iron. This is what happens when you step out of line. Some torture methods were built to extract names. This one was built to erase a future. Iron claws. Curved. Like a tool meant for gripping something that refuses to come loose. Often heated first, not because heat was necessary, but because heat made the room smell like surrender. It wasn't an interrogation device in the way people assume. It was a punishment with a thesis. Your body is not yours. Your life is not yours. Even what you represent can be taken. Women accused of adultery, immorality, witchcraft, heresy, sometimes simply being inconvenient to a powerful family. The accusation didn't need to be strong, because the point wasn't proof. The point was example. Survivors didn't just survive pain. They survived aftermath, infection, shock, scarring that couldn't be hidden, and a society that treated the wound like a verdict you could never appeal. And that's the pattern you'll see again and again in medieval torture records. The damage wasn't always meant to kill you. Sometimes it was meant to keep you alive long enough to be seen. Which brings us to a method people think they know, because it shows up in movies and museum displays like a medieval set piece. Breaking on the wheel. But the real version wasn't one quick smash and mercy. It was protocol, sequence, timing. A practiced routine that could stretch close to 2 hours, designed to keep the victim conscious, breathing, and aware for as long as possible. And after the bones were destroyed? That was only stage 1. Because the wheel didn't end at the execution ground. It continued at the city gates, where the body became a sign. And some of those signs stayed alive long enough to watch the birds land. The wheel wasn't just a way to kill someone. It was a way to teach a city. They'd lay the condemned out like a diagram, arms and legs arranged, not for comfort but for access. And the executioner didn't swing wildly. He followed an order. Ankles. Shins. Knees. Thighs. Then arms. A rhythm of destruction, spaced out just enough that the victim stayed present for it. That's what people don't get about medieval justice. It wasn't always rage. It was procedure. And when the bones were finally ruined, they didn't always grant the release of death. The body, still breathing, was threaded through the spokes. Limbs woven into the wheel like broken branches forced into a fence. Then the whole thing was raised on a pole at the edge of town. So you could see it from the road. So you could smell it when the wind changed. So your children would ask what it was, and learn the lesson early. Some died fast from shock. Some didn't. Records describe victims lasting days, conscious in flashes, while rain chilled open wounds, while insects found soft places first, while birds tested whether the eyes would blink. And here's the final twist that makes this worse. The wheel wasn't only punishment. It was an advertising board for authority. A reminder that the state could turn your body into architecture. So when someone later whispered, "Don't speak too loudly," they weren't being poetic. They were being practical. Because the next methods weren't always about bones. Or blood. Sometimes they were about creating pain so invisible that no one could prove it happened, while the victim confessed with a clean face. And the next one uses almost nothing at all, just an animal, a container, heat, and panic. The most frightening torture stories aren't the ones with the most blood. They're the ones that sound plausible.
A quiet room. A legal sentence.
A tool that looks ordinary. And a victim who realizes too late that the system isn't trying to learn the truth. It's trying to manufacture certainty. That's why medieval records are so chilling to read. They don't sound like horror. They sound like administration: dates, names, witness lists, costs of materials, confession obtained, case closed. And here's where the modern mind gets trapped. We picture torture as a medieval outburst, a cruel person doing cruel things. But much of it was the opposite.
It was institutional, delegated, normalized.
Sometimes even regulated, with rules about when torture could be used and how a confession was supposed to be confirmed afterward. Which raises a question that should stop you cold. If a confession had to be confirmed, then even they knew people would say anything to make it stop. So why did they keep doing it? Because torture didn't just produce information.
It produced compliance.
It produced fear. It produced stories that authorities could point to as proof that they were protecting society from enemies, heretics, traitors, witches, outsiders. And once a society accepts that suffering can be an acceptable tool for order, the toolbox doesn't stay small.
It evolves. It gets specialized.
It gets political. In the next section, we'll move from the spectacle punishments, built for crowds, into the quieter ones, the techniques that left fewer marks, generated cleaner confessions, and let officials claim with straight faces that no brutality occurred. And that's where things get really uncomfortable, because the logic behind those methods didn't stay in the Middle Ages. If you want to understand medieval torture, don't start with the devices. Start with the incentives.
A city wanted stability. A church wanted purity. A ruler wanted obedience.
And fear was cheaper than fairness.
Fear scaled.
So the system rewarded techniques that did three things: pressured the victim into a confession, kept them alive long enough to be processed, let officials deny responsibility afterward. That's why so many methods aimed at exhaustion, disorientation, shame, and clean suffering, experiences that don't always leave the kind of injuries a crowd can point at and say, that's torture. And it created a horrifying legal theater. Because in many places, the confession wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the paperwork that justified everything that followed: property seizure, banishment, execution, retaliation against family. So when someone finally broke, the system didn't say, we're sorry.
It said, good.
Now sign your name under it. And here's the emotional trap: even if you survived, you often walked out with your life socially confiscated. Your neighbors knew. Your employer knew. Your children knew. Sometimes you were marked by rumor alone, sometimes by visible injury, sometimes by a court label that followed you like a second shadow. This is also why historians argue so fiercely about specific famous devices you see in museums. Some displays are authentic. Some were reconstructed centuries later for spectacle. Some are real but rare. Some became popular in legend because they're visually unforgettable, even when the day-to-day reality was simpler and more bureaucratic. Which is scarier? A mythical machine that may not have existed? Or the ordinary, documented practices that definitely did? Because next, we're going to talk about the methods built not to impress a crowd, but to break a person quietly enough that everyone could pretend it was justice. There's a reason some of the most effective torture methods don't look violent. They look like restraint.
Like detention.
Like procedure. Because when pain is loud, it creates witnesses. When it's subtle, it creates deniability. Medieval authorities learned that a person can be broken by forces that sound almost harmless on paper: deprivation, confinement, stress positions, isolation, humiliation. Not a single dramatic wound, just the slow collapse of sleep, appetite, dignity, and time. And the deeper you go into the archives, the more you find something modern audiences don't expect.
Disagreement.
Not about whether suffering happened, about how it was justified, how it was recorded, and how much was hidden. Some courts kept meticulous notes. Others destroyed records. Some clergy condemned excess.
Others signed off on it.
And in places like inquisitorial courts, the bureaucracy could be so tight that cruelty became compliance with protocol. That's why the same case can read in two ways. A confession freely confirmed, according to the court. A mind finally shattered, according to any human being with empathy. And that tension, between legal language and human reality, is where the horror lives. Because once you accept that truth can be extracted by suffering, you don't just punish the guilty. You create a machine that can manufacture guilt. And if it can manufacture guilt, it can manufacture enemies. Which means torture isn't just a crime against a person. It's a weapon against entire communities, minorities, political rivals, women without protectors, outsiders with the wrong accent. In the next part, we'll hit the moment medieval torture stops being only about interrogation and becomes something colder: social control, punishments designed to outlast the victim, to keep working long after the room is empty. And once you see that pattern, you'll recognize it in places you didn't expect. Social control has one obsession: visibility. Not just make them suffer. Make everyone else see what happens to people who don't behave. That's why medieval punishment often targeted identity,
speech, reputation, belonging.
The goal wasn't only pain, it was containment. To turn a person into a warning label that walks. And even when punishment wasn't physically visible, the story was. Authorities made sure rumors traveled. They wanted the marketplace to police itself. They wanted families to discipline their own members out of fear. Here's the darkest irony: the crowd didn't need to love the system. They only needed to believe resistance was pointless. So the medieval world built layers of deterrence. Public sentencing to create shame, public ritual to create inevitability, public memory to make the lesson permanent. And when that wasn't enough, they didn't just punish the accused. They reached outward, into property, children, relatives, neighbors.
Confiscation, banishment, associates.
A confession could become a net thrown over a whole street. That's why torture-generated names were so valuable. Whether true or not, they let power expand. It's also why the victims you remember from history are often the ones with dramatic endings, because those are the stories that survived. But the most common medieval suffering was quieter: months in a cell, loss of livelihood, isolation, being marked as contaminated, being forced to live inside a community that now looked at you as an infection. And once you understand that, the question changes from, how could they do that?
To this:
how many ordinary people participated? Not because they were monsters, but because the system trained them to call it normal. Next, we're going to confront the most unsettling part of all: how religion, law, and morality were used as language to make cruelty feel righteous. So righteous that people slept at night after causing it. The medieval world didn't torture in spite of morality. It often tortured through morality. That's what makes it so hard to look at. Because the people ordering these acts weren't always hiding in shadows. They were judges, clerics, officials with seals and robes and prayers. They used words like purification, correction, salvation, order. And if you can convince a society that suffering is medicine, then cruelty stops feeling like cruelty. It starts feeling like treatment. That's why some records read like spiritual counseling beside a list of punishments. It's why you'll see phrases that translate to things like "for the good of the soul" or "to reveal the truth." Language that doesn't just justify harm, it sanctifies it. But here's the fracture line historians point to: even in the Middle Ages, people knew torture could create false confessions. Legal thinkers wrote warnings. Courts sometimes required corroboration. Some regions argued over limits. Those debates didn't stop the practice. They just made it smarter.
More procedural. More defensible.
More survivable for the people doing it. And once torture becomes an institution, it develops a kind of self-protection. If the victim confesses, the system is proven right. If the victim dies, the system claims the victim was too guilty or too weak. Either way, the institution wins. That's the psychological trick. A closed loop where every outcome is interpreted as confirmation. And that brings us to the part of this story that reaches forward into the present. Because the medieval period didn't invent cruelty. It invented the bureaucracy of cruelty. The idea that you can file, approve, document, and routinize suffering until it becomes just how things are done. In the final section, we'll pull back from the individual methods and ask the only question that matters after hearing all this. What do these systems look like when they don't wear medieval clothing anymore? And how do you recognize them before they become normal again? Here's the uncomfortable bridge between medieval torture and the modern world.
The tools change.
The logic stays. Once a society accepts that fear is an acceptable ingredient in order, it will always find cleaner ways to apply it. Ways that look lawful, sound reasonable, and leave just enough ambiguity for everyone to look away. That's why this topic matters beyond shock value. Not because we're trying to win a contest for the darkest history. Because the medieval era shows what happens when power gets permission to treat bodies, and minds, as resources. And the most haunting part is this: many victims weren't defeated by pain alone. They were defeated by isolation. By the realization that no one was coming. That the process was legal. That their community would believe the stamp on the document more than the truth in their eyes. So when you hear these stories, don't only picture a dungeon.
Picture the street above it.
The ordinary life continuing.
Markets opening.
Bells ringing. Children laughing. People stepping around horror because it's been filed into the category of normal. That's the real warning buried in medieval records. If you only remember the devices, you'll miss the lesson.
The lesson is the system.
The system that can turn suffering into routine. The system that can turn confession into currency. The system that can make cruelty feel righteous when it's wrapped in procedure. So here's what I want you to do. Tell me in the comments which part disturbed you most. Not the goriest, the most revealing. The moment you realized this wasn't chaos.
It was design.
And if you want more history that doesn't flinch, history that shows you how the world really worked, not how we wish it did, subscribe, because the next stories get even closer to the present than you think. One last thing they don't tell you in the museum. The scariest method wasn't a device. It was what came after. Because medieval punishment didn't always end at the verdict, or even at the execution. It spilled into the survivor's body, the family's name, the neighborhood's memory. If you lived inside consequences designed to keep punishing you quietly. Employment gone, marriage impossible, people crossing the street when they saw you coming. And if you died, the warning stayed.
Bodies displayed. Stories repeated.
Children taught to fear the state the way they feared fire. That's why the phrase "it's worse than you think" isn't about gore.
It's about design.
The medieval world built a system where suffering was documented like accounting, defended like theology, performed like a trade, and consumed like public entertainment. And the most chilling question is this. How many people had to cooperate for it to feel normal?
A judge signing a warrant. A clerk copying a confession.
A guard turning a key. A neighbor gossiping. A crowd watching. A priest offering comfort that also reinforced submission. No single person had to be a monster for the machine to run. That's the part worth carrying into the present, because modern cruelty doesn't always announce itself with chains and dungeons. Sometimes it arrives as policy. Sometimes it hides behind paperwork. Sometimes it borrows moral language to make you doubt your own instincts. So if this video did what it's supposed to do, if it made you feel that cold recognition, then share it with someone who thinks history is over. And comment one word: remember.
Not for the spectacle.
For the people who disappeared into a system that wanted them forgotten. There's a reason these stories stick to your ribs. They force you to admit something we'd rather keep romantic and distant. The past wasn't just violent.
It was organized.
And organized violence has a signature.
It creates categories.
Heretic.
Traitor. Witch. Deviant.
Labels that feel like certainty, so nobody has to feel guilt. Once a person becomes a label, you can do anything to them and still sleep. Because you're not hurting Giovanni or Isabella. You're correcting a problem. And that's why the medieval period is so valuable to study in the dark history niche. Not because it's edgy, because it's a case study in how fast a society can slide when fear becomes a public virtue. Here's the micro detail that should haunt you. Communities often helped.
They testified.
They repeated rumors. They pointed at the outsider. They watched and called it justice, and went home feeling safer. But safety built on cruelty is a temporary drug. It needs higher doses. So methods escalated.
Rules expanded.
New enemies were discovered. And every time the machine fed, it proved itself necessary. That's how you get a world where suffering isn't an exception.
It's a tool in the drawer.
Now, if you're still here, you're ready for the final twist most channels don't touch.
Not just how torture was done,
but how it was remembered, rewritten, and sometimes deliberately mythologized to distract from the quieter, documented horrors that were actually common. Because the stories that survive aren't always the truest ones. And that's where the real investigation begins.